Jonathan, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and I'm here with Assistant Professor of Sociology, Jonathan Cox from UCF, one of our very many colleagues who is deep into critical race theory, and I asked him to join me for this conversation, and he has agreed to. Would you mind introducing yourself to people who might not know you and talk a little bit about your research background?
Sure, sure. Thank you for having me as well, Robert. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you for this. And so for folks who might not know me, I'm fairly new to UCF. This is, I think, the end of my fourth year as an assistant professor here. And so in sociology, I broadly consider myself to be a race scholar. And so I merely go about that because for me, I think that race is one of the most meaningful concepts, right, constructions that we could think about in current times, right? And so I just kind of funnel everything that I'm doing through the lens of race, right? Just how does race impact things, or how is people's racial identities, racial experiences, how is that impacted by whatever else that I might be looking at? So I don't study only race, but I do look at that as kind of a central feature. And so, with that, I think about things like racial ideologies, really big into like the new forms of racism that we see, how racism has shifted and changed over time. And then most recently too, looking at different issues with just diversity and inclusion processes at different places like institutions or in the workplace.
So what are the classes you teach that address race or address race as a central feature, which is that?
Sure. So at the undergraduate level, I teach a class that's appropriately titled Race and Ethnicity. And so that's kind of just a broad survey of race as it has happened, sociologically speaking, in the United States, historically, and most importantly, contemporarily. We kind of get into that. I also created a course on race and social media. And so we look at, the ways that race and racism are embedded in and are experienced in social media platforms or in web spaces in general. At the grad level, I actually will be teaching a class specifically on critical race theory coming up in the next spring semester. And then again, since I look at education as another area that I'm really big on, that's where my background was. And so in my education courses and at the grad level too, one of the central features we look at is race. We look at race, class, and gender, and kind of how education is impacted by those. So all those different things. And so some of the classes that I teach with regards to race.
All right, great. So, you'll be fielding a lot of this, let's say, inquiry when we return in the fall, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And I think just to kind of preface our conversation here, I think people get the political context of the attack on critical race theory. So I don't really want to have a conversation, that everyone sort of has access to in the current media. And what I want to talk about is what we should be doing in regards to teaching, research, and advocacy as scholars and professors on campus at UCF. So to kind of lead us off here, let's talk about the classroom first. Believe it or not, but I've actually had chemistry professors and biology professors approach me within the last couple of weeks who are concerned that they, in their classes, might be restricted from conversations they wish to have, which kind of floored me because I thought it would mostly be in the arts, humanities, or the social sciences where we would find these concerned professors. But no, that's not true. At least people in the hard sciences are also concerned about the ways in which these efforts might restrict the conversations they wish to have in the classroom. So what would you say to an instructor grappling with this? Like what would you say they could do, they shouldn't do, or anything like that? What advice would you give?
Sure. And so, I kind of would echo your surprise, but in a positive way as well. Like, I think it's great that, people in other areas that we might not expect are wondering if, a ban on being able to teach topics like critical race theory is going to impact them, right? That to me suggests that they are really thinking about, their field and their own understanding and then what they can do with it. So that's fantastic. I think some of the things that, folks like that can do is one, kind of consider the broadness of some of these bans. And that may sound like, maybe more of a limitation. But in the broadness, there's huge ambiguity, right? Some of the language that is used in not only the Florida's ban, but other states that have done similar, have enacted similar legislation, it doesn't even really specify like what can or can't be used. And so that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Where, people can kind of come after folks and try to use a broad umbrella to cover what they might be teaching. But then again, that also gives a lot of leeway. And so effectively what many of us are looking at doing is just maybe shifting some of the language that we're using when we're talking about different things, right? And so you can cover, at most teachers, right? Professors, teachers, anybody that teaches folks kind of know that you can continue to talk about a particular topic from many different ways, right? You have different avenues. And a lot of that is because of historical processes that prevent people from being able to say or do certain things in specific ways, right? Like this isn't necessarily anything new. This is just a new iteration of same things we've experienced before. And so maybe think about approaching the topics you want from a different angle, right? So maybe don't use some of the quote unquote buzzwords that people have been throwing around in particular for this past year, right? So maybe approaching it from different angles, thinking about your problems that you're presenting more broadly, and kind of just engaging students in conversations. I also really like to think about engaging students and trying to critically engage students in thinking about their own thought process and their own ideas, right? So that's an invitation for people who may have different perspectives or different ideas, whether they're things they really believe in or they're still learning about, to talk about that, right? That's one of the things I do in my own classes. I create space to invite folks to share what are some of the misconceptions you might have, some of the myths you might believe in, and let's talk about them, right? Let's see what's fact, what's not, kind of parse that out. And so I think folks can do that in their various areas by, again, just thinking like, let me step back and approach it from a different angle. Instead of coming at it straight on like I might normally, if I'm concerned about language or how people are going to respond to me, maybe I can come around it from the back or the side, right? And just have a slightly different conversation where you're talking about the same things, but just maybe in a different way.
Sure. And so, one of the things you had said, I think, I probably been employing for years. So I teach civil rights, and I research and write about race as well. But I've never, not that I've read critical race theory, but I've never employed the term in any professional way in the classroom or in my own, my own publications. But I do specifically say and use the terms structural racism or institutional racism, and then talk about that and give examples of that, provide evidence of that. You know what I mean? And my students and I, at least, have these conversations, which I don't want to get it, is that the same thing or not or what? But I mean, certainly, students do want to engage those topics and do want to talk about these things. I mean, I think in the world, the Florida governor exists and some of these politicians in Tallahassee exist is just kind of a fantasy, and they just don't understand students, in the way that we do, since we interact with them,
Absolutely,
on a frequent basis.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we can move on to research then. So if we think about these same ideas, and you research and publish on race, I research and publish on race, and as I mentioned, I would be more apt to employ, alternative terms to critical race theory. But is this giving you at all a sense of pause for your own future research? Would you be apt to be a little more circumspect? And what would you say if someone came up to you and said, I'm doing this research, but I think this isn't the right time to publish this? What would you tell them?
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And one of the observations I've made is that, right, even in my own PhD program, right, I literally studied critical race theory. It was one of my substantive areas. But what's interesting is, other than this past, I would say 6 months, maybe, I never even thought to identify myself like as a critical race theorist, right? Or even said that. And I've, many publications that I put out, I'm trying to think of any that I actually, like you said, employed the words critical race theory, right? And so, again, what you end up doing, and if you actually understand critical race theory, right, if you, like you're saying, people can kind of go out and look into that stuff, then you see it's really just a tool for understanding things, right? And so it's an underlying theoretical perspective. And if we think about all the theoretical perspectives that people use, they typically don't employ them in the ways that people are trying to suggest that folks do with critical race theory. And so for me, I think there's that pause because it's like, well, people are talking about it now, and there seems to be like consequences somehow being set up. But again, when I think about it and the way I publish, I don't really say those things. I don't talk about them in the same ways. I just talk about, if my article is about racism in a broad sense or in some specific area, I'm talking about that, right? And so I may be coming from that perspective broadly, but you're not going to see those words. And so I don't know that I would change anything necessarily, right, in terms of the research that I'm doing, because I don't necessarily posture it in those ways, unless I'm doing so like intentionally, right, as for a particular publication or for a particular audience, or if I was writing something that was specifically about critical race theory, like I'm not very likely to actually use those. And if you read much of the literature where critical race theory is actually used and brought out, they don't really do that either, right? Like, unless the book is about critical race theory, they're just talking about whatever aspect of, society, history, et cetera, that they normally do. And so, I don't think it's really going to change much.
I think, and I might be wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of think critical race theory was a term that came about for an idea that was already around, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And it grew out of the critical legal studies, all that good stuff.
Right, critical legal studies. But if you think about, like, the works of, William Julius Wilson, the declining significance of race, that's all, that's all institutional racism and structural racism. And there were his predecessors to that, right? That
absolutely.
So the idea was out there without the term, and then the term came along as a shorthand, maybe, or maybe to employ it in a very specific niche way.
Absolutely. And I would agree with that, right? We see aspects of what we now call critical race theory, which you're pointing out, right? Throughout history, we go back to, Du Bois even, right? Like, people who have been doing this hundreds of years ago, right? At the very beginning of from our social science,
right?
Doing the same stuff.
Right? Didn't they employ the term race man? Like, one was a race man.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Du Bois and others. Yeah, that whole generation.
Yeah, they're right. The whole Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, like, there were all these things that were happening, like you're saying, where people were using these methods. And what we end up seeing, not just with critical race theory, but lots of other things, is that over time, somebody kind of coins the phrase that maybe speaks for this, where they pull together all these different theories and say, hey, like, these people were doing very similar things. And now I'm just here's an overarching way to explain it, right? And so, it's, again, people are focusing on the term, kind of to the exclusion of what it actually means and what it's actually used for.
Yeah. Ignorance has no bounds, right? That's what we've learned from this.
Right.
So to kind of put in a much more personal context to the individual who might be listening to this podcast, we address academic freedom in our collective bargaining agreement. It's enshrined in there. So we do have academic freedom. We know that UCF recognizes this. So people should not fear doing their due diligence in their research and their teaching as they wish, because the collective bargaining agreement will protect them, no matter what a governor or a state legislator might say. But, and this is what I'd like to propose to you, is what do we do as an ally to those who don't have the protection of academic freedom? And I'm thinking about, like, the K through 12 teachers, who are going to be, quote unquote, indoctrinated by Governor Desantis in this new effort to teach civics the right way, right? Which is to disabuse them of critical race theory, and they're going to be paid $3,000 if they do this workshop, right?
Sure.
So I know there's a lot of K through 12 teachers out there, and again, they don't have the academic freedom protections that we do at UCF. So what would be your advice to our colleagues? How can we be allies to them? How could we be lending support to them?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, to think about it's a great privilege, right? Honestly, and it's a hard fought privilege. You're not to diminish it in any way, but it is a privilege for us, those of us who do have this kind of protected academic freedom. And so one good way is for us simply to help to be the voices for those who maybe aren't able to use their voice, right? And so we can continue to kind of speak up, for lack of a better word, right? Be the ones that make all the noise about some of these issues, because we have this protection, right, that's embedded within our own jobs. And so we can, obviously we need to make sure we're in concert with these K through 12 teachers, right? So we're not like just speaking for them and over them. But, assuming we understand what they're saying, their own concerns, we've spoken with them, which many of us do already. So we're very connected with them. Then, yeah, again, using our voices, speaking up, we'd be the ones who kind of bring a lot of these things to the attention of legislators, right, to let them know that we disagree with these ideas, to continue to help actually explain what critical race theory is and how it's used, to go against these kind of false claims or exaggerated claims that people are making. So I'm really big into the allyship, right? I think that when you're in a space where you are the more privileged person or the more privileged group, you should use that, right? And that means maybe potentially putting your own privilege at risk. And again, for us, that's great because we don't necessarily have that strain in our own lives. And so I think we can do a lot to speak up. We can do a lot to kind of help them think through how they could adjust or change up, right? So they can maybe teach some of the same stuff that they want to, but like we were talking about before, maybe they have to readjust like language use or how they approach it, or ensuring that they are maybe doing even more to bring in the perspectives of other folks and really helping to drive home, the critical thinking, because that's what we all want, right? Even these misguided laws that are coming down from DeSantis and others, right? They, at the core of them, they talk about teaching critical thinking, and helping people learn in these ways. And so we can hold them accountable to that too, and right, to kind of push back against the system where some of our peers in K through 12 maybe aren't able to do so.
Great. Well, thanks. We know we like to keep these conversations short, so we'll end it here and hope that people will be inspired by this conversation and, at least feel comfort going into the classroom, knowing that it's still their classroom and they are still clothed with academic freedom. I would like to thank you for joining me today, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.